Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for a good lunch and a chance to get some fresh air and exercise. And now as we go into another seminar, we ask that you would lead and guide and teach us. And I pray that you would help us to stay awake after lunch. It's not always easy. So thank you for your presence and for your guidance. In Jesus' name, amen. Winning the Weed War, 15 tips to achieving victory. Has your garden ever looked like this picture? I don't know if you can see it very well. Yeah, it's like, I know they're in here somewhere. I know I planted carrots here, but you're kind of searching. Oh, there's one. That's very discouraging. And it's obviously not a way you can have a market garden, otherwise you wouldn't make any money. I can tell you this, one of the first years when we started market gardening, and we'll share more tonight, but we knew nothing. And there was no internet. I had no internet access then, and so we were just learning by trial and error. 1998. So the first year we decided we were going to grow for the winter, we planted carrots. And it was like this, literally, the grass grew, because carrots take a long time to come up. And so there was more grass than carrots. And it took us, I think, like 2 weeks, just you're trying to keep the carrot from coming out as you pull all the weeds around. It was terrible, but it was a good teaching experience. So we want to try to avoid this kind of situation, and I want to give you this quote. He who tills the soil is to make his work an object lesson of the careful, thorough work which must be done in the culture of the soil of the heart. Isn't that beautiful? When we understand the biblical concept of weeds, what do weeds represent? Sin. That's pretty obvious, I think. How many weeds do we want left in our heart? How many? That's a high calling, right? How many of you have no weeds in your garden? We're not there yet, but that's our goal. Our goal is a weed-free garden. And those who were here the previous one, I'll tell you, when we visited Connor Crickmore's garden, we had to look for weeds. It was amazing. You had to really search to find weeds. So this is one reason why weeding in the garden is so important, because as we do it, God is teaching us to get out the weeds in our own hearts. And then it becomes an object lesson for, the beauty of the garden is it's a perfect opportunity to share with others. People come and they say, oh, wow, this is so beautiful. There's no weeds. And then you can share, we really have a strong conviction that weeds should not be in the garden, because God is trying to teach us that that's how he wants our hearts. So it can be an incredible experience. So this is going to be a little bit of a repeat for those who were in the previous session, but this is becoming more and more important to me that if we will focus on the structure and the health of the soil, then everything else becomes easier. What's the soil spiritually? The heart, right? Now, we like to focus on all the externals, eating the right food and dressing the right way and all these things. And I'm not saying those aren't important, but we need to focus on the heart. And if you focus on the heart, then those other things usually take care of themselves, right? God will bring convictions. Really important to increase organic matter levels. I was telling somebody earlier I can't get into it too much. I'll get derailed, but we use a lot of peat moss. What did they call it here? Turba? Masharina? It's somewhat controversial in some parts of the world because some people think it's being harvested unsustainably. From my research, at least in North America, the peat is growing faster than it's being harvested in Canada. Huge. And Siberia, I know, has many, many, many hectares of peat. So the beauty of it is it increases the organic matter and increases the tilth of the soil without unbalancing the soil. If you use compost, depending on your compost source, if it's from manures and stuff, you can easily throw your soil out of balance and get too much phosphorus and other things. So you have to be careful using compost or manures. But peat, from my experience and from my study, is something you can use without throwing your soil out of balance. Now, you can't do that on many hectares because it would be way, way too expensive. But a small area, you can afford to invest in it. We spent about $2,000 on peat moss last year. But in my mind, and my son as well, says that was the best money we ever spent because it made everything else easier. So you also want to make sure your soil chemistry is balanced. And unfortunately, I guess they said Werner, how do you say, is going to talk some about that. But unfortunately, I don't think there's going to be a lot on that this time, which is, I would encourage you to go to audioverse.org, and there's many talks on soil science there. Keep the soil loose with the broad fork. We talked about that in the last time. So if you do these things, your soil will be so easy to work with. You can just dig. You don't need a tool for transplanting. You just use your hand. It's so nice. And so then when it comes to the weeding, I wish I had a proper collinear hoe. But when it comes to the weeding, it's just, like this. I mean, it's so simple. There's none of this, it's just, and if depending on what it is, you can just walk like this so fast. So that's the most important thing, I believe. But another really important thing for a small market garden is transplant as much as you can. Why would you want to transplant as much as you can? You have a 3 or 4 week head start on your weeds. So that's huge. And there's many other reasons for transplanting as well. But for this session, this is the big one. If you direct seed, like I was just saying, many of the weeds are going to grow faster than your plants, except maybe radishes or something. But if you transplant, you know exactly where the plants are, and you can cultivate that same day if you need to. Immediately gives you a 3 or 4 week or more. Can you all read that? Head start on the weeds. And then this is another one we talked about this morning. When direct seeding, use a multi-row seeder. By seeding multiple rows at the same time, you keep the rows evenly spaced. So, ideally you have a string. And if you're seeding, the first pass, you're following the string, just going right along the string. Then the next pass, you're using this. This needs to be loosened up a little. And this is going in the previous row. And so by using this, then it's much easier to cultivate in between. Number 4, use tight plant spacings to shade out weeds. Weeds will only germinate and grow, I shouldn't say only, but weeds germinate and grow best when they have plenty of light. So if you learn the plant spacings, and this is a little rule of thumb here, plant leaves should be touching at 3/4 mature size. So if your lettuce is going to be this big, then you want the plants close enough that they're going to be touching about this big. And that way they shade out the weeds. And you have very little problem once they start maturing. Number 5, use stale seed beds. Do you know what that means? I mean, very simple concept, but this is I feel like this is one of the most important as a home gardener, because it's so simple. All it is prepare your beds for planting 2 or more weeks ahead of time. So usually, I don't know how it is here as far as garden preparation, but usually in the States, what will happen is, the person gets out their rototiller. You have those, right? And then they rake it, and then they plant immediately. And all they've done is bring up all the seeds from down in the soil with the rototiller, and they're like, yay, let's go to town here, let's germinate and grow. And so you've just created a huge bed of weeds that are going to compete with your crops. So what you do is do your bed preparation 2 weeks ahead of time. Of course, I don't really like the tiller. I don't really recommend using a tiller. But however you prepare your beds, do it ahead of time. Rake it just like you're going to plant, and then leave it. And if it's dry, water it. Because what you're trying to do is get the weeds to germinate. So once they germinate, you have a choice. This is a good way to do it, just something like this. Something that you can just lightly skim the surface of the soil. You're not going deep because you don't want to bring up more weed seeds. You're just trying to dispatch those ones on the very surface. And then ideally, you would water it again and see if there'll be less weeds that come up, but there'll be some more that come up, and then do it again. And then seed your crops or transplant. So it's just a matter of thinking 2 weeks ahead of time. which we're not so good at, but we need to get better at it. Prepare your beds, wait, and then plant. And you will get rid of 80% of your weeds with that simple technique. You'll still have a few weeds, but you won't have that huge flush like you often do. Does it make sense? Okay, use specialized cultivating hose. And we talked about some of these this morning. The collinear hoe. And that's one, and I wanted to mention that the best tools, these hand tools, the best ones come from Switzerland. All our tools on our farm are from Switzerland. Glosser is the company. And I think I have, where do I have? Maybe I didn't put the website. I think I didn't put the website. But you can go online, Glosser, something, Glasser. So I know they're available in Europe, but really high quality tools. They have, this was one that Elliot Coleman invented, but Glosser produces. And it's got a nice handle, and you're just sweeping the soil, just using the same hands, thumbs up position that you would use a broom. Very simple, not hard work. So that's the collinear hoe. Stirrup hose, unfortunately, we don't have one of those. Well, here, there's a picture of one right there in the back. See that hanging on the wall, red? And it's just, they have different sizes, but it's just got a sharp blade. It's sharp on both sides, and you do this with it. On the push and the pull, you're cutting. That one works very well on harder ground or on the pathways. The wheel hoe. This is one of the best tools for a garden of any size. And I have a picture a few slides down of my son a few years ago using a wheel hoe. But the wheel hoe, the Glosser wheel hoe, comes with the same stirrup hose, but you can get them much bigger. And you're doing like this. Or if your ground is good and the weeds are small, you can just literally go like this, as fast as you want to go. And, if it's got a blade this wide, you can cover a lot of ground really fast. And it's, if you're doing this, if the ground is hard or the weeds are bigger, it's kind of like using a rowing machine at the gym. And I tell people, forget the gym membership. Just spend that money on a wheel hoe, and you're staying fit and growing food. It's a win-win situation. And there's lots of different attachments for the wheel hoe. You can buy discs that kind of hill up. So for like beets, or other crops that like a little bit of dirt on top of them to cover the beets, you have these discs that pull the dirt in. And the wire weeders, there's all different sizes depending on your spacings. But this one's kind of neat because it can be a narrow, just a narrow little one, or wider. Again, this is not going to work on hard soil. But if your soil is loose, if you've got it in good shape, so fast, just run that through the soil. And all the little weeds that you can't even see, they kind of collect on here, the little roots. And you just, it's a wonderful way to, Eliot calls that the pacifist hoe, because you have much less chance of decapitating your plants. So another one I don't have a picture of. Well, what? Yeah, maybe afterwards you can come. There's pictures of it in this catalog here. Is a flex tine weeder. They have these for tractors. Just lots of metal tines. Have you seen them? And they just go through the ground. And it's called blind weeding because you can weed right over the plants. Depending on what the plant is and the size, but like carrots, they have a good root even when they're this small. So you can they have a handheld version, just run it over there, and it's just those fingers are kind of just, as they go through the soil, they're vibrating, and they any tiny little weeds are just going to pop right out. So those are specialized tools. If you're a home gardener and your budget is small, you have to pick and choose wisely. If I was just going to go with one, I would go with the stirrup hoe, because it can be the most versatile. But if I was going with two, I'd choose the stirrup hoe and the collinear hoe. If you're a market gardener, you need to get whatever is going to make you the most efficient. So here's a picture of the wheel hoe. And actually here, my son is using it. It has a furrower attachment, so you can make a furrow for planting potatoes. But it's got that small wheel in the front, and you're just pushing it along. It's wonderful. So this is a real key. You have to have time for cultivation in your schedule. Now, of course, there's always reasons why, if it rains or something, obviously it's not good for cultivation. But if you schedule it, you're much more likely to actually make it happen. Because especially on a market garden, there's so many other things you kind of like, oh, that can wait, right? That can wait. And then finally, when you get to it, it's a big job rather than just a little job. Mrs. White uses a phrase, little attentions often repeated. Are you familiar with that? That's a great motto in life. Little attentions often repeated. That's the key to weed control. Do it often, and it's a little job. If you wait, it's a big job. Sorry, this is a little hard to see, even for me here. Okay, so this is just a few tips on cultivating. Cultivate in the morning on a dry, warm day. That's the ideal time. If the weeds are small and the ground is dry and the sun is shining, those weeds don't have a chance. All you have to do is disturb the soil and they're done. Once they get this big, you want to cultivate them when they're that big at the largest. Ideally, you can't even see it. You're just stirring the soil, and the weeds are there, so you're getting rid of them before you even see them. If they're bigger, if they're this big, and especially things like grass, and you use something like this, which of course is hard to do with weeds that big, you'd have to use a stirrup hoe. But because it's just slicing off the roots, if the soil is moist, then they just sit there and they're going to grow new roots. So these tools really only work best when the weeds are very small. If they're big and you cut them off, then you've got to get them out. You've got to rake them up and get them out so they don't re-root. Does that make sense? Or, I mean, if it's really hot, if it's really dry, then they may still die. If you need to, I know it's after lunch and you're all wanting to take a little siesta. Just stand up and walk around or breathe deep, and it won't offend me if you're standing up. So, yes. What tools? If you just have a small raised bed, I would probably say use the tools closest to you, which is your hands. If it's just a small area, and I mean, seriously, if your soil is loose, then you just kind of do this and you're done. Okay, I don't want to get sidetracked with questions, otherwise we won't get through it. So let's save the questions and we'll talk about them at the end. Make cultivation as much of a priority as planting or harvesting. Again, as I said, we tend to say, well, that can wait. No, it really can't. Think about this from the spiritual point of view. If you do that with your children, what happens? Oh, those weeds can wait. They won't be a problem. It doesn't work. The time spent is an investment that will pay dividends later. So you're investing in your soil, you're investing in your plants. So I'm going to encourage using shallow till or no-till. And again, I realize that this is probably controversial. There's going to be differing opinions, and that's fine. We can have differing opinions. We want to be true to the Word. And from my study, I don't feel like this is untrue to the Word. But, nature, nowhere in nature do you see soil inversion. That's a very unnatural process. Now, I have to say also that sin has many organic gardeners worship the earth. They believe that earth, if left to itself, will correct all problems, and you just have to let nature do what nature does. But from a Christian viewpoint, we can't accept that totally because we live in a fallen world and nature is fallen. And so we can't always go to nature and say nature has all the answers. God has the answers, right? Not nature. But having said that, I think for the most part, nature, even though fallen, how can I say it best? Usually, nature doesn't know, but God knows what's best, and we can learn from nature. And nature builds soil from the top down, right? You just go into a forest and you look at the soil, it's beautiful, right? Because of the leaves that fall and break down. And so why do we want to turn it upside down? I'm not sure. My personal observation is that the more you disturb the soil, the harder it becomes. It becomes very crusty, hard to work with. The less you fool with it, as far as tilling it, the better it's going to be. So I'll look forward to what Jury has to say, because he might have a different approach, and that's fine. So whether you like it or not, there's lots of weeds in the top 6 or 8 inches of soil, especially if it's been plowed in the past. And every time you turn the soil over, you're just giving another flush of weed growth. Plus you're burning organic matter. And this, this ties into climate change and all of that. There's a lot of evidence that the more the soil is disturbed, the more CO2 that's released. And of course, you also have more issues with erosion and all of that. So I think there's a lot of reasons, at least from my viewpoint, in either just tilling very shallow, and this is another tool that Elliot Coleman came up with. It's called the tilther. It's battery powered again, but it's like a mini rototiller. It's just tilling, this deep. So you're making it nice for seeding, but you're not going deep and mixing it up. Number 9, use plastic or fabric mulch. Now, again, this is something we don't use a lot of because it's unsustainable, because it's a plastic derivative, although they are coming up with plant-based plastics, which are a good option. But I can just tell you some things. Here we are planting strawberries. I would never try to grow strawberries again without plastic. We did that when we started out, and we about lost our shirts, as they say. We couldn't do it profitably. So here, I would say follow the 60-day rule. If you're going to have something in the garden for more than 60 days, it may be worthwhile to go to the effort of putting down either plastic or fabric. They have the woven landscape fabric, black. You have that with lines. You can burn or cut holes. And for things that are going to be in the soil for a long time, that can really cut down on the work of cultivation. For things like lettuce or, any direct seeded crops, it's not very practical. A lot of people put lettuce in it, so I shouldn't say it's not practical, but, if you're growing transplants, half its life is in your greenhouse, so it's only in the garden for a month, and you have to decide whether it's worth going to the work of putting the plastic down. Use organic mulches. So obviously you would think, well, why not use organic mulch? Because that's building your soil. And it is. But there can be a number of potential drawbacks. Number 1, the mulch itself can have a lot of seed in it that creates its own weed problem. Number 2, it keeps the soil cooler, which in the summer that may be a good thing, but in the spring that can be a bad thing. It also keeps it more moist. So if you have a very moist environment, it's going to encourage disease and also slugs, snails and slugs and that kind of thing. They love those organic mulches. So you have to just look at your crop and look at your situation But obviously, it's wonderful if you can be adding to the organic matter in your soil by using organic mulches. Now, this is one that I love. This transformed our farm, actually. And this we first saw at Jean-Martin Fortier's farm up in Canada. The market gardener, he was using these silage tarps. And when he pulled that silage tarp back, and I saw these huge worms just covering the surface of the ground, I was like, wow, this is amazing. And the soil was so loose and moist, it was just incredible. So basically, what you're doing, you're getting this heavy-duty UV stabilized plastic that Christian, you had a name for it here in Romania. Yeah, the dairy farmers use it, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it depends. There are different types of plastic, but especially we have this one. I already bought one.
But you want to make sure it's heavy duty. You know, it is plastic, so you don't want to have to throw it away every year. You want it to last for many years. You have to make sure it's UV resistant. And it needs to be kept down ideally for 3 or 4 weeks. And so the ideal, say you have a cover crop. You've been growing, cover crops? You know what I'm talking about? You grow something just to build the soil, like, say, wheat. In the fall, we sow wheat and clover together, crimson clover. And, in the spring, it'll be this tall. And so then we'll go in and we use a flail mower, a flail mower to chop it up, and it just sets it right there. Then you want to water it. Make sure the soil is good and moist, and cover that with the silage tarp. Put sandbags around it to keep it down. And in 4 weeks, you pull that off, and the ground is ready to plant. It's amazing. I said it's the closest thing I've ever found to no work gardening. It's still work because you got to drag that out and all this, but it makes soil preparation so much easier because that silage tarp keeps, it traps in the moisture. The moisture's not going to go anywhere, and it warms the soil, and it's dark under there. So the worms love it. The worms come up to the surface and they take that organic matter and just take it back down. And also, the warm, moist environment germinates a lot of weeds, but they can't grow because there's no light, so they die. So you're getting rid of those weeds. And, if it wasn't plastic, I would say buy a bunch of it. Because it's plastic, it's, that I have that reservation, but a lot of people have asked, well, isn't that plastic hurting the soil? I've tried to do some research and I haven't found out anything on that, but what I can say is the worms and the other things haven't figured out it's bad for them because they love it under there. If it is bad for them, they love it. 60 degrees. Well, yeah, I'm not sure what that is in Fahrenheit, but it doesn't get as hot as clear plastic. We're going to talk about clear plastic too, but that will get hotter under it than the black. But if many times for us in the spring, we grow a lot of beets. Beets are a big big moneymaker. So when the beets get big, it's hard to cultivate, because the leaves are kind of all over. So usually the weeds, you always get some weed growth in there. So when we harvest the beets, we'll just put the tarp down and we don't have to worry with the weeds. We don't have to get them all out. So just put the tarp down for the month of July. The beets are usually out in June, month of July. And then in August, we pull the tarp off and we're ready to plant our fall things. Just that simple. It's really, really nice. Okay, try flame weeding. So this is probably, you can get single burner ones that are not so expensive, and you're just burning the weeds. And this is nice because you're not disturbing the soil and bringing up more. You don't actually need to burn the weeds. So if you just hold it on the weed until the weed is disappeared, incinerated, you've wasted a lot of propane. All you have to do is barely, just slowly go over it like this. And what it does is it bursts the cells. The heat expands the moisture in the cells and they burst. And you can't even tell at first. Well, what you can see is they'll just, they're kind of like this, and then they just kind of go like this. And you're not sure, are they actually dead or not? You can pinch them, and if it leaves a finger mark on the leaf, you know that you've killed it. But you just come back in a couple hours, and they're really dead. Again, they need to be small. If they're big weeds, you're going to have to do it multiple times. So they need to be small. They can be a little bigger, this big, but they need to be small. And it doesn't work very well on grass. It works really well on broadleaf weeds, but grass is much more resistant. And this, of course, can be combined with the stale seed bed. So you prepare your bed ahead of time, just go over it with the flame weeder, and then wait another week and go over it again. This is the best way to plant carrots. Because then when you seed your carrots, they're going to come up with virtually no weeds. Or you can do kind of the same thing with the silage tarp. And we did this year. I wish I had a picture of our carrot pad. Huge carrot pad with, almost no weeds. Amazing. So we just had the silage tarp down. Then we'd pull it off and let the weeds germinate for a few days and put it back on. And actually, we only did that once. Then we took it off and seeded. It was amazing. Use clear plastic for solarization. I have not actually done this yet. I've wanted to, but I've never gotten around to it. The soil should be moist, and it needs to be in the summertime when it's hot out. And the best is if you seal the edges, dig a trench and put the plastic in and cover it up. But I've seen some people do it without sealing the edges, and it still works pretty effectively. And this will actually sterilize the soil about that deep. So it's going to kill weed seeds. It's going to kill disease organisms. And, a lot of people question, well, we don't want to sterilize the soil, do we? But what I've read from the research is that, it only goes this deep, and then the good bacteria and everything from underneath will quickly recolonize. And so it doesn't seem to have long-term negative effects. And I can tell you both Elliot Coleman and another grower I know who used this said that it was very, very effective for getting rid of weeds. I don't know if you have here, we call it chickweed. Does anybody know what chickweed is? It's actually edible. You eat it, or you can eat it, but it's very, very, it's the worst weed in the winter garden because it's a cool weather weed. It grows very fast. It has a very fibrous root system, and it will go to seed very quickly, even in the winter. And using this has really helped eliminate chickweed for these growers. Okay, do you have these in Europe? You never want to let weeds go to seed, because there's a saying, 1 year's seeding is 7 years weeding. If you don't want to spend the next 7 years weeding, you want to control your weeds from going to seed. So maybe that means if it gets out of hand, you're out there with your, what do you call the weed eaters? Or your scythe. Let's see how, like this. You're cutting it down before it goes to seed. And then the last one I would just mention is using smothered crops to outcompete weeds. Plant something like, say you're going away for a month in the summertime and you're not going to be around to cultivate. Do you know this crop, buckwheat? That's super fast growing. If you seed it thickly, it will smother the weeds out. Some that we use in the summer would be buckwheat, soybeans, cowpeas, sorghum, Sudan grass. I don't know if you have that. And in the winter, your cereals, your wheat, your rye work well. In fact, rye has what they call an allelopathic effect. When rye dies or is tilled in, however you deal with it, it secretes a substance that will keep seeds from germinating for, from my observation, about a month. And you want to make sure you seed it really thickly so that it really smothers out the weeds. Okay, so in closing, I would say to view these things as tools in your tool chest. You're not going to use them all, and they may not all be relevant in your situation. But the more strategies you use, the better chances of keeping the weeds from winning. It's very short-sighted to allow other farming or gardening activities to take priority over cultivating. Now, in this world, are we ever going to get rid of all the weeds? No, because they're blowing in. You're tracking them in on your shoes. You're never going to get rid of all weeds completely. But there's plenty of evidence to show that if you're faithful with this, and I've seen it, myself, that within a few years, your weeding is much, much lower. All financially profitable farms that I know of have their weeds under control. you don't go to those farms and they're not out there harvesting, trying to pull the weeds aside to harvest. It's not efficient. You have to have control of your weeds. And ultimately, a weed-free garden will be a much more enjoyable place to spend time. I don't know if you know this from experience, but the more weedy your garden is, the less you want to go there, right? If it's beautiful and pristine, you love to go out there. But as soon as, you go away for a week and you come back, the weeds are grown up. Oh, I don't even want to look at it. I don't want to go there. But we want the garden to be a place where we love to be, right? Yes? No? We're not used to people being so quiet. Yeah, so we have time for a few questions. Okay, here, then over here.
We're speaking about strawberries that we put plastic.
Yeah.
Just in their name they have straw. So why don't you use straw?
Okay, the question is, why don't you use straw on strawberries? Because straw has a lot of drawbacks. Well, what we do is a totally different system. We plant in the fall, and then we harvest in the spring, and then we get rid of them. Yeah, we just work them into the soil. So it's just 1 year. But the plants produce more, and then you have individual plants. The problem with what we call the matted row system, where you let the runners just fill in, it's very, very hard to control the weeds. You can put straw down, but weeds are going to come through the straw. And then our straw has wheat seeds in it. So you put the straw down and all the wheat grows up. So we started out using straw. That's what we tried. And it was so labor intensive that we couldn't make it profitable. Okay.
Yeah, just a quick one on the tilling. I understand about trying to move towards no-till. We're trying to do that ourselves. However, there are a few quotes where Sister White speaks, specifically about not just plowing, but plowing deep. And so, how does that kind of...
Yeah, unfortunately, you weren't here for my previous meeting where I addressed that briefly. And so, I'm open to counsel from others, but my interpretation of that is that she's talking about working the soil deeply. In her time, plows were what they had. That was what everybody used. So I think a broad fork, you're familiar with the broad fork, that works the soil deeply, and we use it before every crop pretty much. So we're working the soil deeply and working it often, but we're not inverting it. So that is my take on it. I'm not saying that's the gospel, but I can just tell you again from my personal observation of our farm, plowing often and plowing deep destroys soil structure and brings up weed seeds.
I
would like to ask you about do we still have to keep 7 years to keep soil away from planting? Is it still valid?
Wow, that's a big topic. Well, I can just tell you this. We just rested our land last year and took a sabbatical. So I guess that's all I'd say on that.
So what do you do with weeds? Do you just put tarps? Do you just tarp everything up?
What do you do with weeds on your sabbatical, you're saying? Well, we had good intentions of planting a long-term cover crop of alfalfa, but because of circumstances, that didn't happen. And so part of it we covered with silage tarp, a small part we covered with silage tarp. The most of it we just let grow what grew, but then we mowed it. I was afraid to let it go to seed. Although, we're dealing with areas where there's not a lot of specific counsel. Mrs. White does talk quite a bit about the 7-year rest for the land, and it's fascinating to study what she has to say about it. But as far as how they dealt with the soil, I'm assuming because, they were harvesting what grew up naturally, that means they would have let the weeds grow up. And I've heard some interesting theories from people about how weed seed can actually, fertilize the garden. That's just a theory I've heard. I can't speak to that. But anyway, it's a fascinating subject that, and I will just say this as well. My wife, at the end of last year, told somebody it was the best year of our lives. So, God blessed in many ways. So that's just our personal testimony of it. And that was without having the money to live for a year. But, God says, prove me. So we said, let's prove him. And he proved faithful. So that's our testimony on that. And we can share more later if you want. Okay, our time is up. One more question. Yes.
Any tips about couch grass?
About couch grass. Honestly, I'm not sure what couch grass is. I've heard of it before, but I'm not familiar. If we have it, I don't know it by that name. So what I can say is this: any weed can be dealt with little attentions often repeated. I'd like to see it. So you have it here, and it grows under the, yeah. It's called work. We want to try to figure out how to do it without the sweat of our brow, right? But that was part of it. By the sweat of your brow you shall eat your food, right? So we're continually trying to figure out how to get out of work. Now, I just talked about efficiency. So obviously on some level you are trying to get out of work and get it more efficient. But even the most efficient market gardeners still are doing a lot of work. And so I don't have I can say, I think if you put a silage tarp down for a year, it doesn't work. Try 2 years. I think that's one solution, but the other is just start in a small area and you just have to keep on it. Those underground things can only survive so long without energy. And so you just keep at it.
Husband was just saying that we have the same little grass. He was just saying...
Yeah, just very quickly, we took just one bed, and then I had to just go through, obviously, on my hands and knees, just digging down, pulling up, just digging down. But it took a really long time just to do that one bed. But when it was done, it stayed clear for a couple of years.
Yeah, okay, good point. Just keep at it. Little attentions often repeated. Okay, let's take a break and we'll meet back here